So this is the fourth day of our class, and of course the fourth in the lecture series for the African American course. And we're still exploring the issues surrounding what I've described as the African American vernacular and its construction of a poetics and an aesthetics for African American life. Today we are focusing on Frederick Douglass. So we've moved on to the slave narrative. So this talk is going to be divided into four sections. One will introduce slave narratives as a whole, framing them within a context so that we begin to understand how they came about, what their audiences were, and what their purposes were, and how they functioned in 17th, 18th, and 18th, 19th, and 19th century, and by extension, to some extent, in the early 20th century. Then we'll follow with a focused look at Frederick Douglass in three parts. We'll look at his life and times. We'll also pay attention to some of the thoughts and ideas that he developed. And then we will look at his legacy, the impact of his legacy, and the implications of his legacy, and some of the key topics that surround Frederick Douglass. And that should wrap up our talks for today. So to start off, it's worth thinking about it that the slave narrative would constitute probably one of the earliest articulations of the enslaved people, and becomes a kind of record of the life of slavery, the lived experience of slavery among African Americans and in other parts of the world, in other parts of the Americas, in the Caribbean, and in parts of Latin America. There existed these narratives written by slaves and articulated by slaves. It's fair to say that the slave narrative operates in two ways. There are two functional approaches to what the slave narrative is, and each of them has different implications in terms of what they represent and what they constitute. On one hand, the slave narrative is a book that is written as told to. This is an approach that says that somebody who is literate would interview the enslaved person. The enslaved person would tell their story, and a literate person, almost always a white person, would write the story down as the story was told to them. And this meant that there was an interlocutor, somebody in between, a kind of middle person that would transfer the story that is being told into written language, and then that is what would be eventually published. So the slave narrative, as told to, obviously has a number of things surrounding it in terms of its purposefulness, its veracity, its intentionality, the question of its audience, and of course the telling about why that might be necessary, the circumstances that might make that necessary. And then the second slave narrative is a slave narrative that is written by the enslaved person. That is, they write it in their own hand. They are actually the authors of their slave narrative. And yet, in the same way that the slave, while the function of writing the narrative would be important, and there are great implications of the fact of an enslaved person actually writing their own story, the secondary part of it is the publication of the slave narrative. That is, it is one thing for a book to be published, for an account to be written, but it's another thing for it to be published. In order for it to be published, there has to be a mechanism that allows for it. And for the most part, enslaved people could not be publishers of their own work. So there are these two factors, and they're two really, really critical factors in the understanding of the enslaved person, because very often those people who wrote their own narratives, those enslaved people who wrote their own narratives, were accused of falsehood. They are accused that they couldn't have written it, that somebody else actually wrote it for them. And it was a very important challenging of the intellectual capacity, the intelligence, and all the other elements that an enslaved person would have. We talked about Olauoda Equiano and his narrative, his autobiography. And one of the things we saw in Olauoda Equiano's own quotes and his own statements was him arguing, interestingly, that he's a humble writer, he's unlearned and untutored, but he's actually writing these words himself intentionally. demeaning himself to suggest that that they should trust that these were his words. The interesting thing about the slave narrative as told to is that it typically had to be the function of the agenda of the person who was writing down the narration. In other words, the person who was transcribing the narration. And more often than not, the person who was transcribing the narration was intending for this narration to bear witness to the atrocities and the horrors of slavery. It is rare that a slave narrative was written to promote slavery. The slave narrative was almost inevitably, with very few exceptions, written to denounce slavery, to be evidence of how horrendous slavery was, and to be part of the massive argument, the massive cry against the enslavement of African people. And so consequently, the person who was writing these slave narratives down was also guiding the process by which these stories may have been told. And one could argue that they were in danger of manipulating these narratives in that way. But of course, there's really no good reason to hold to that, because almost all the slave narratives that were written that became presented as evidence, and evidence that would affect both parliamentary and congressional and political forces, was also used as evidence for the general public, so that the general populace would understand something about the enslaved person. In each instance, however, the most fundamental message behind the slave narrative, as we saw in Olauoda Equiano's autobiography, is the humanity of the enslaved person. It is to humanize the enslaved person, to propose that the enslaved person was not a beast, was not an animal, was not debased, was not something that could not have the capacity to feel, to think, to have joy, to have a sense of loss and sorrow, but somebody who was sentient, could think and could operate in the world and could function in that world. And why was this very important? This was critical for the movement towards the abolition of slavery, because one of the core arguments against the abolition of slavery was the argument that the enslaved person had no capacity to function in society, that the enslaved person was by nature, and not even circumstance, but by nature, dependent. They was immoral, didn't have any kind of moral values and moral systems, and could not function in normal civilized society. The feeling was that this therefore made slavery a benevolent gesture. Slavery was a gesture to protect them from their own self, to protect them from the abuses that they would face within society, and protect them from what damage they could cause in society. And this infantilizing of the African person, infantilizing them to suggest that they have no sort of capacity, that they're just people who have high emotions. They laugh, they dance, they are bashful, but they have no sort of sense of themselves. That image, that caricature, and that stereotype was so prevalent that in many ways the lie, the myth of the benevolence of slavery as a system was constantly perpetuated. However, those people who emerged, who told their story, and who gave the details of slavery, were actually pushing against that idea. So that's one thing. The second thing that the slave narrative was very important for was typically the control of information was rested in the written word, the published word, and the word of and the trusted word of the white people. And for many in places like the northern parts of the United States, and of course in Europe, and in places like England, where the money that was earned through slavery found its way and actually enriched them and created all kinds of changes in society and so on and so forth. Those people did not have access to the plantations. They did not go to the plantations. They could not be eyewitnesses to the impact of slavery on individuals. They were not part of the slave trade. They did not go on the slave ships. They were just people in society who did not have access to YouTube. They did not have access to television cameras going around, and so on and so forth. And so consequently, any information, any reporting that they had of what slavery was like, what enslavement was like, what the capture of Africans was like, what the conditions were like for the enslaved person, what the life on the slave ship were, all those reports came from the white people who had access to publication and to language and to writing. And it also came from the part of society, the people within the society, that is the very enslavers themselves, the very people who were enslaving them. It came from them. It came from ministers who went to these places and were supposed to be preaching the gospel and who were so-called witnesses to what was happening in slavery. So there was a massive propaganda effort by slave society, by slave societies that were designed to perpetuate and to keep the system of slavery going, by planters societies, by societies of slave owners. There was a great and massive propaganda effort to spread the word, a PR effort to spread the word that slavery wasn't as bad as people made it out to be, that slavery was something that was benevolent, slavery was not horrible, the enslaved persons were happy, and they were fun-loving people, and so on. All of these myths and lies were being perpetuated. And so consequently, the impulse to move into the first person account of the enslaved person who had lived through slavery, who was going to tell the stories of their experience in slavery, became something much sought after. And many publishers recognized that there was something sensational about this. There was something sensational about having people who have experienced slavery, who have experienced the suffering of slavery, or who are actually living inside of slavery. Their opportunity to tell the true story of their enslavement and the life of the slave was a great opportunity for book sales, for newspaper sales, and for all these other kinds of things. So keep in mind that the slave narrative then was constructively designed to address a particular population. And of course, the particular population was not the African themselves, because the African themselves did not have the ability to read, and they were deprived of that ability to read. They couldn't. I shouldn't say the ability, but they did not have the opportunity to read. They didn't have an opportunity to become literate, and therefore they would not have access to the books that we are talking about. So if we think of the slave narrative as primarily directed to the European population, the readers, the people who had capacity to read, and the power systems, then we can understand why some of the rhetoric of the slave narrative was of a particular direction, and a particular direction, and a particular characterization. This would change, of course, with somebody like Frederick Douglass, who would eventually begin to think of his readership as beyond the people that he was addressing, the people that he was challenging, the system that he was challenging. But he was also creating a narrative in the 3 biographies that he wrote, autobiographies that he wrote. He was slowly developing a sense that he was creating a narrative of the African Americans' movement from slavery to freedom through his language and through the things that he wrote. So that is one of the things I think is worth bearing in mind when we think of what the slave narrative's intentionality might have been, and therefore that would affect the content of the slave narrative. And of course, one can imagine how much more powerful it would be to say that the enslaved person learned to read, learned to write, and could write their own story, which debunked the notion that they didn't have any capacity for intelligence. They did not have any capacity to challenge the ways that the system worked. They did not have the capacity of language and voice. And one of the greatest orators of the 19th century, and who will still remain one of the greatest narrative orators of American history and American life, would have been Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass' oratory and the power of his oratory would be demonstrated in the biographies that he wrote. So slave narratives would become prevalent during the 19th century and during the period moving up to the abolition of slavery in 1865 in America and 1838 in the British colonies, and would be very influential in the shaping of that. So.